before we jump in, I just want to preface this with the fact that we're going to be using Create React App. Under normal circumstances, if you're building a design system, you would not use Create React App. You would want to have a different kind of pipeline, a different environment. Maybe you want to use a mono repo if you have different packages for different types of components. Maybe you have React, maybe you have Angular. A mono repo like Lerna would allow you to do that. We're not going to be setting that up today for several reasons. I'm not an expert in mono repos. Secondly, it might not be the best solution. There was a library called Create React Library, which is really cool. It's linked in the website. And it was really great, but I could not get it to work very well with styled components. And it's great for actually deploying your components to NPM. It worked super well with NPM, but I wanted to use CSS and JS, and I didn't want to run into errors. So because I want to focus on how we build styled components and the styling in Storybook, we're going to use Create React App. But you would not use that in production. OK, let's do it. So you can open your terminal. I'm going to save my project to my desktop. I just find it to be the easiest. And I'm going to use NPX to create this React application. NPX comes with NPM version 5.2.0 and greater. It's a great tool that allows you to use different versions of packages to create your application. So previously, like you would run create React app and then your app name. With NPX, you do NPX create React app. And so you don't need to have create React app globally installed. That's another important thing. NPX lets you do that. So if you have NPM greater than 5.2, you can use this command. And if you don't, that's totally fine. Just use the create React app CLI tool. Does everyone have create React app enabled? Like you're able to use it? OK, so we're going to create React app. I'm going to call it my component library. And I'm going to chain two commands together using this ampersand. You could run this and then the second command cd into it, change directories in. I'm just going to do cd create React, or my component library. My component library. So this is going to create this new component library, and then it's going to change directories so we are in there. Mine might take a second, but while it does, I want to show you a really cool tool. Let me go to the notes here. This tool is a CLI tool for VS Code if you're using VS Code. It's going to allow you to actually run like a code command to open your current directory in VS Code. So you can grab that here. It's again on the website. It's the CLI interface tool. So what this is going to allow me to do, once I'm actually in this directory in my terminal, I can run code dot, meaning the current directory. It's saying open that current directory in VS Code. So I'm going to be doing that in just a moment. But if you want to go download it, this is where you can find it. I'll also show you my editor settings, just in case I have a couple things that you're curious where I got them while that's still loading. So in terms of font, a really fun font that has ligatures I use is, I think it's called Dank Mono. Dank Mono. This is the font I'm using in case you're curious. I think it's paid. I think it's about 40 British pounds. But it's really, really nice. If you don't want to pay for it, what was the other one I was just going to mention? Veracode. Veracode is free. It looks very, very similar. And you can download this for free, use it for free. It looks very similar. I just repeated myself. So those are my two fonts that I would choose from. Another fun thing that you can do is these material icons. I'd just like to share this with you since we're waiting. So this allows you, like if you have a project and you drag it in, when we create ours, you'll see mine. It'll actually use the material design icons on the side for all the different files, and it looks really pretty. So that's another plugin that I really, really like. Can you define styled components? Yeah, so styled components is a CSS and JS library. It is, if you Google it, styledcomponents.com. This is what it looks like. In contrast, Emotion, like I mentioned, Emotion is another CSS and JS library. They're very similar. They have very similar foundational elements. And so the whole concept here is we're going to create JavaScript files. We're going to actually apply CSS directly onto these HTML elements. And once you do that, you can just render them like normal elements. So that's what a styled component is. It's a library for creating CSS in JS components. We are now inside of my component library directory. So I'm gonna, like I mentioned before, I'm gonna run that code command. It's gonna open my current directory in VS Code. You can get the link to that again on the website. Okay, so the first thing that we're gonna do is delete everything inside the source folder. This is a lot of boilerplate, so I'm just gonna select all of this by holding Shift and delete. Okay, from now on I'm gonna use this integrated terminal in VS Code, and you can open that by pressing Control backtick. And let's go ahead, well, let's not start our dev server yet because it's gonna break. So inside of source, create a new file, call it index.js. Okay, let's import React from React, and we'll import React DOM from React DOM. Okay, let's just instantiate a simple stateless functional component that just returns a div saying hello world. So const, what did I call you, app, and we'll do an H1. We'll be semantic and we'll say hello world. Okay. Let's render it. So React DOM.render. We'll render our app, and we will use document query selector to grab the root. You can also just use get element by ID, whatever you prefer. So now if I run npm start, it should spin up our dev server if it doesn't take 2 weeks to start up, and it should show us a header tag that says hello world. I use a tool called Spectacle to snap my windows if you're wondering how I'm doing that really easily. But there are much better tools that are maintained that you can use as well. Okay, so we've got hello world. That's exciting. Let's actually go ahead. Let's install styled components. I'm going to create a new terminal window in VS Code by pressing this plus. And there are 2 ways that you can install. I'm going to close my sidebar with Command B. There are 2 ways that you can install this. So you can write npm install styled components, or you can just simply write npm I styled components. It's kind of the shorthand. Components. Did I spell that right? Yeah. So let's go ahead and install that. And while that's installing, we can actually go ahead and start using it. So the first thing we want to do, let's create a new component folder. So inside of source, create a new folder called components. And we're going to add a buttons.js file. Now, a fun little trick, if you want to just do both of those at the same time, if you hit new file and you type components/buttons.js, this is going to create a folder and put that file inside it. So that's a fun little trick. So we've got our buttons.js file inside of our components folder, and let's create our first style component. So the first thing we need to do is import styled from styled components. Okay. Now let's just build out a little simple primary button. So const primary button. The way styled components work is you're going to have this word styled. It's going to say, hey, styled components, I want to style, and you give it an HTML element. So I want to create a button. So styled.button. You're going to put 2 backticks like you would if you were using template strings. And everything inside here is going to be our CSS. You would just write it like you would in a CSS file. Sometimes if you're using React like inline styles, it's different shorthand, like you would write margin right if you were doing some inline styling, but you can just write regular CSS. So you just use the hyphenated, so like margin right, like that. Okay, so let's give it some properties. Let's give it a background color of red. Let's give it a border with no border. We'll give it a color of white. We'll give it some padding of 12 pixels, 24 pixels on the left and right. And lastly, let's just set font size to 1 rem. The last thing we just want to do here is just export. I'm going to use a default export for right now. We will come back and refactor this. But here's our default export. So as soon as this is done, we can go instantiate this and hopefully it works great. Okay, so just to reiterate, you just have to write the word styled followed by the type of component you want this to be styled upon. And you'll see when we actually go and instantiate this button, you would just use the regular tags like you would for any HTML element. It's just a styled component. So let's head back over to our index file in the root of our source folder. And let's import primary button from components, buttons. So because we're using the default export here, we don't need those curly braces. For those of you who are kind of new to this whole process, a default export, you don't need those curly braces, but if we were exporting many different kinds of things from the same file, you would need a named export. So we'll see those differences in just a little bit. Okay, so style components is now installed. And let's change this from an H1 to a primary button. If you're wondering how I selected those, if you highlight something in VS Code and you press Command D, it'll highlight every instance of what you've highlighted. It's a really great way to like change the start and end tag of something very quickly. So primary button, just like that. Now we can see our button is showing up in our UI. So that looks really nice.